My name is Kirby Lockard, and you're watching one of the Design Drawing Videotapes. This is a series of 10 videos designed to help students of architecture, landscape architecture, and interior design learn how to draw freehand perspective sketches. This particular tape is number 5, and it's the second tape in a 3-set series on shadow casting, and its particular subject is shadow casting on exterior perspectives. Like all the other tapes in the series, it is designed for you to draw along with me. And in order to do that, you're going to need a minimal set of drawing equipment like is contained in this little blue glass. You're going to need a set of 3 Prismacolor pencils, a blue, a green, and a red. You're going to need a black Prismacolor pencil and a white Prismacolor pencil. And for the series on shadow casting, we're also using a violet Prismacolor pencil. Then we need 2 markers, a fine tip marker and a little broader tip marker. And I'm going to be using a red marking pen to identify casting edges, just because it'll show up better on the video. In addition to that, you need a supply of buff tracing paper, like this, with which you can overlay the exercises. And you need the set of exercises that come with this videotape. The first one we're going to do looks like this. So if you have this set of drawing equipment and you have the exercises, let's put the first one down and begin to cast shadows. Let me say one other thing about the videotapes. There are 2 ways to use the videotapes that are such an improvement over a live teacher. One of the things is, if I get ahead of you, if I run off and leave you, and you're a little confused and I've hurried you and the vocabulary is a little cumbersome, just stop the videotape and rewind it and replay it. The other way is the opposite of that. Once you get on to shadow casting and you feel you're learning it, stop the videotape and see if you can go on ahead of me. See if you can do the next steps in shadow casting, which you know I'm going to show you on the videotape, but see if you can do them before I do them, as a means of testing your learning. Okay, with that advice and those warnings and all that equipment, let's start to cast the shadows on this by picking up your black Prismacolor pencil and assuming that the sun is coming over our right shoulder, behind us and to our right. That means that this surface would be in shade. It means that because of its orientation, it would be turned away from the direction of the sun and so would get no sunlight. And if it gets no sunlight, that also means that it's not going to get any shadows. So once you begin to make a general sun assumption and a sun shade analysis, you can confidently shade in all the surfaces that would be turned away from the sun, because you're not going to have to draw any shadows on those surfaces, nor any sunlight. And again, you should think of these in sets. Once you see that that surface is a shade surface, you can see right away that there's this surface, and this surface that have a similar orientation. They're all sort of left sides, and they must be turned away from the sun like the first one was. So we can shade in all those. The other surfaces that you can always shade in are the undersides of things, and there are 2 of those in this little perspective. They're the soffits at the head of the door recess and the window recess, so we can shade those in. Okay, now we have specified the general position of the sun, and while we're at it, we can probably take our white Prismacolor pencil. Whoops! Turned over my cup. A little noisy, but we won't let that bother us. Let's shade in, or I'm sorry, sunlight in the main face of the building, because there's nothing in front of this building that will cast a shadow on it, and it'll make our perspective begin to look better. And I think that's important. I think that you ought to begin to render light on your buildings as soon as you find out that a particular shadow or a particular patch of sunlight is the way it's going to be. Put it in there, because it makes the drawing look better to you. And one of the prime things in learning to draw is to begin to like your own drawings, so that it becomes a self-rewarding, kind of pleasurable activity, and you look forward to the time that you spend drawing. So we can put white all over the face of the building, and we can put white all over the face of this little low retaining wall in front too, because we know nothing is in front of it that's going to cast any shadows on it. And now notice that the little perspective begins to get a sense of light and begins to look a lot better. And all we've drawn is sort of cloudy day illumination. We haven't really cast any shadows yet. So you should always take the time to do this, even if sometimes you won't have time to cast the shadows. Okay, now, so far we have, draw a little stake with me right here in the perspective. So far all we have done is specify the general direction of the sun. And if you draw a line there on the ground and a line from the near vanishing point on the ground, all we have done is say that the sun is coming from this quadrant and that the shadow of that little stake is going to fall somewhere in this quadrant. We haven't said yet how long it's going to be or exactly what angle it's going to be. And as you know, as you remember from the introduction, perpendicular shadows like this vary dramatically during the day. So our next step is to specify exactly the horizontal angle of the sun and the vertical angle of the sun. Let's do the horizontal angle first, and let's just say that in this particular situation we want this shadow to go off across the ground like that, so that it lies on the surface of the earth at that angle. That means that we're going to have a vanishing point over here for sun's rays on the horizontal or eye level vanishing line, because they're occurring on a horizontal surface, and all horizontal surfaces recede into that red eye level vanishing line at visual infinity. Let's write eye level vanishing line. Now, the other thing we know, when we locate this, which we're calling the flagpole vanishing point, we know that we can draw a vertical line through that point, and here let's use our violet colored pencil. We can draw a vertical line through that point, and that will be a sun's ray vertical vanishing line. That is the plane, that is the vanishing line for the planes of the sun's rays. So we know that out of this red flagpole shadow there's going to grow a vertical plane, and somewhere in that plane there will be an angle, which we're going to choose right now, for the actual sun's ray. Let's say in this particular case that we decide a sun's ray should be like that. Now we can just extend that sun's ray until it intersects with the sun's ray vanishing line here, and we will have found a sun's ray vanishing point. Now this also allows us to draw the little violet triangle, which you may remember from the introduction on shadow casting. We can draw the little triangle in now, because we have the three component parts that it takes to make that triangle. Let's take a moment and just remember what those are. They are at the back an actual flagpole, a vertical stake or pole that's casting a line on the horizontal Earth's surface. At the base we have a flagpole shadow, and the hypotenuse of the little violet triangle is actually a sun's ray, which I'll abbreviate just SR. Okay, with that information we can now cast the shadows in the rest of the perspective, and we're going to do it first of all by determining the casting edges. And this is a very important step in shadow casting. We have to locate, identify all those outside corners that separate a sunlit surface from a shade surface. And let's start with this corner of the building, which is obviously one of those. It separates a sunlit face of the building from the shady side of the building. Now, and once we identify one of those, we look around the perspective and see how many others there are. Now, if you want to stop the tape at this point and see if you can find them yourself, please do so. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and say there's another one there, and there's another one there. After we've found what seem to be all the vertical casting edges, we need to look at the horizontal casting edges. And here's one right at the top of the retaining wall for the little step pocket. It separates a sunlit horizontal surface from the shady side of the little retaining wall. And it's a near vanishing horizontal line. So we look around the perspective and see if there are any more of those. Well, there's at least one more here. This is a near vanishing horizontal line, and it separates a sunlit roof, even though we can't see the roof, from a shady left side. When it gets to the back corner, the casting edge turns, and now we're going to get a hidden casting edge down the back of the building. It's separating the sunlit roof from the shady back side of the building. There are two more here, and they're this casting edge and this casting edge. And I think that's all the edges that will cast the shadows in this perspective. Now let's look at the sets. Let's first take the flagpole set, the set of vertical casting edges, and remember that their shadows are all going to march off to this flagpole vanishing point. So we can draw one there from that corner. We can go over to the door jamb and draw one there. We can draw one there on the windowsill, and it's going to be a little difficult because it intersects at a very acute angle. And there's going to be one down here cast by the casting edge at the corner of the little step retaining wall. So there are 4 flagpole shadows, all converging to this flagpole vanishing point. Well, the next thing we need to ask ourselves is, how long are they? Well, let's look at the 3 here that hit a vertical surface. When they hit the vertical surface, the casting relationship changes because the shadow's being cast by a vertical casting edge, and that vertical casting edge is parallel to the vertical surface now that the shadow is going to start to climb. So those shadows will just begin to climb up those 3 vertical surfaces like that, parallel to the line that's casting them. This shadow, however, strikes no vertical surface, so we're going to have to find the end of it. And the way we do that is we draw a sun's ray from the top of the casting edge to the sun's ray vanishing point, like this. And where that sun's ray intersects this flagpole shadow will be the corner, or the end of that casting edge. It'll be the corner of the building. At that point, the edge that casts the shadow is this horizontal top of the building, and it's parallel to the Earth's surface, so its shadow will be parallel on the Earth's surface, which means it goes to the same vanishing point, which means it turns and goes toward the near vanishing point. But how far does it go? Well, we need to find the shadow of that corner. We could do it with a sun's ray, but that's going to be a little difficult because we're trying to intersect this parallel shadow on the ground with this sun's ray, and they are so nearly parallel to one another that it's very difficult to judge where they intersect. We can do it another way. We can assume that there is a flagpole here at the back corner of the building, and if there were, we'd get that corner by drawing a flagpole shadow from the corner. So we can do that like that. And when we do, we get a much more obvious intersection between that flagpole shadow and this parallel shadow. So we have found the back corner, the shadow of the back corner of the building right there, and then the shadow is going to be cast by this hidden casting edge, and it's parallel to the Earth's surface, so its shadow simply turns and goes toward the far vanishing point like that. Now let's fill in that shadow black because we have it all now, and we can fill it in black. Don't make it solid black, leave a little light in it, but let's make it a very, very dark gray, because shadows are always darker than shade. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the window and the door and understand that this parallel shadow that we started up the vertical surface will just keep coming in both cases until we reach the shadow of this corner, which is the end of the casting edge. So let's go from those corners to this sun's ray vanishing point with a sun's ray, and where that sun's ray intersects that climbing parallel shadow, we have come to the shadow of that corner, at which point the casting edge now becomes this far vanishing horizontal line, which is parallel to the surface in the recess, so its shadow just comes across like that, parallel in space. Now the other shadow does a similar thing. We need to draw a sun's ray from the sun's ray vanishing point to that corner. We find that it's going to intersect about right there. At that point, it turns and becomes a parallel shadow, a far vanishing parallel shadow, and so we can finish that shadow. Let's darken in those two shadows, and then we'll do the steps and we'll be finished. The interesting thing about shadow casting is that as the shadow pattern begins to develop, your perception, your eyes will sort of tell you whether it's right or not, because we've been reading these patterns all our lives, and we read them very well. It takes a little trouble to learn how to draw them, but once we begin to get them drawn, our eye will tell us, yeah, that's right. That's just about exactly what that shadow would really look like if you shone the sun on it. Okay, now the steps, there is one small complication, but we won't have any trouble with that. We've climbed this parallel shadow up to the nose of the step, and we begin to wonder, when are we going to encounter the shadow of that corner? Well, we can find out by drawing a sun's ray from that corner to this sun's ray vanishing point. And we see that we haven't reached it yet because we haven't intersected that violet line, and that's what we have to do. Okay, so we climb. When we get to the horizontal surface, the shadow once again becomes a flagpole shadow and goes off to the flagpole vanishing point like that. When it reaches the vertical face of the next step, it turns to parallel, and now we intersect the violet line a little over halfway up that step. Now we're going to blow that up to a larger size so that you can see what's happening. So far we have drawn this shadow, this flagpole shadow. We made it climb the step as a parallel shadow. We went again to a flagpole shadow. It started climbing this step, and when it got to about there, it was cut off with the sun's ray, so that we know the shadow of that corner is right there. Now, we have the problem that the shadow is on a vertical, far vanishing vertical surface, and it's being cast, remember this is the casting edge we're dealing with, it's being cast by a horizontal, near vanishing horizontal line, and they don't even intersect, so it's very difficult to understand how the shadow will work. Well, what we have to do is force their intersection by putting a handle on that blue vertical plane and pulling it up to this position. I think you can imagine it's just a vertical sliding panel, and you just pull it up until it's in that position, and when it's there, I think you can see that its shadow will just go home to the base of the line that casts it, like that. Now, we don't need the top part of it, we just needed that little part there. So we can collapse the panel. We can draw this parallel shadow across the horizontal surface of the next step, and when it gets to the back corner, it simply goes home to the base of the edge that's casting it. So that's what our shadow looks like as it climbs a step. Let's go back to the bigger drawing that we were working on originally. Put that shadow in, and we're finished. Remember, we found out that it climbed the step like that, then it turned into a parallel shadow, and then finally ended, as all shades and shadow systems do, in a perpendicular shadow going home to the base of the line that casts it. So let's darken in that shadow. And if you had any trouble keeping up with me or understanding the nomenclature of the procedure, please replay the videotape and see if you can do it ahead of me before we go to the next exercise. The next perspective on which we're going to cast shadows looks like this. So you need to get this out of your packet, put it down, and it's a little more complicated, but we're going to go through it with the same procedure, and I think you'll see that even a fairly complex perspective can be shadow cast if you just know the step-by-step procedure. Like the other perspective, the first thing we're going to do is make a general sun assumption, and in this case we're going to assume that the sun is coming over our left shoulder. It's still behind us, but it has moved across our back and is now coming over our left shoulder, so that this surface is in shade, and you can take your black Prismacolor pencil and shade it in. And if you want to anticipate and get ahead of me, go ahead and shade in those surfaces that you know are going to be in shade with the sun assumed to be coming over our left shoulder. There are going to be these three vertical surfaces and a couple of horizontal ones. Undersides are always in shade. Well, this surface is going to be in shade, as is this little surface over here, the two ceilings of those two structures. Now the next thing we're going to do is, even though it's a little risky, we're going to take our white Prismacolor pencil and whiten in a couple of surfaces that we're pretty sure aren't going to have any shadows on them. Now they have to be the ones that are out front, where nothing is standing in front of them that might cast a shadow on them. But I think we can safely put the sunlight on this surface. And you'll be better if you apply these tones, I think, at a 45 degrees, from lower left to upper right. At least for right-handers, that works pretty well. And it gives a consistency to the entire drawing. It's like putting a grain, like the wood grain on this table I'm drawing over. It puts a sort of a grain to the whole drawing. Mine aren't coming out real well because they're being affected by the roughness of the grain of the table. But generally, if there's a consistency to the way you put down the tones in your drawings, that consistency can do a lot to unify the drawing in terms of technique. The other thing I think we can put, the other surface we can put white on, is this face of this largest structure. Okay, and once we do that, we're going to identify the casting edges, because that's the next step. And we're going to do that with red, and we're going to try, we can white in this surface too. Nothing's going to cast any shadows on that. Okay, now let's take our red pencil and identify those outside corners that separate a surface which is in sunlight from a surface which is in shade. And there are a couple right up front that can hardly be overlooked. There's one there, and there's one there. And if we stick with vertical surfaces, we can see there's another one there. And those we can see both the sunlit surface and the shade surface. Now let's find some where the shade surface is hidden. Here's one. We know that if we walk to our right and looked back at that little surface, it would be in shade. And there's a whole series of these. Okay, so there are at least that many vertical casting edges in this drawing. Let's take some horizontal ones. Let's take, for instance, this kind of a casting edge, which is a near vanishing horizontal line separating a sunlit surface from a shade surface. There's one there. We know there'll be one at the top of this wall. We know the top of the wall will be in sunlight. Now we know that there's one here, even though we don't see the shade surface. And that means there's one there, potentially, and one there. And if we take that same spatial condition to the tops of these buildings, we know that potentially there's one of those there and one of those there. Now here the casting edge is hidden, but we have to deal with it because it may cast a shadow we see. And while we're on hidden casting edges, we missed one back here. There's a hidden casting edge back there at the back corner of this wall. There's also potentially a hidden casting edge across the back of this structure that separates a sunlit roof from the shady sort of back fascia of the building. Now I think we've probably gotten most of the casting edges. No, there's one set we haven't dealt with, and those are the guys we did there with that hidden one, but those are the guys that are transverse or far vanishing horizontal lines. There's one there and one there. We don't see the shady surface in either case, but it would be there. Here's one we do see the shady surface. That one and that one. Now, we may have forgotten one or two, but I don't think we have. I think we have most of the casting edges that are going to be casting the boundary of the shadow. And remember, that's their importance. Unless you identify these casting edges, you'll have a lot of difficulty casting the configuration of the boundary of the shadows. Okay, now it's time, I think, to specify the exact location of the sun. And this time we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're not going to do it by choosing a sun's ray directly. We're going to do it by choosing two shadows on two perpendicular shadows on two of the planes, and we're going to choose two that are the most important. For instance, if we counted the casting edges, we'd find that there are a great many of these casting edges which are vertical, so that the angle of that flagpole shadow on the earth is going to be significant just because there will be so many of them. So I'm going to say that I want to see this shadow, and I want to see this shadow even. So I'm going to choose a flagpole vanishing point right there. You say, how can you do that? How can you have the freedom to do that? Well, I designed this little structure, and I'm going to put the sun where I want it to be. And I'm going to take the two choices that I get. I'm going to take first a choice of the perpendicular flagpole shadow, and then I'm going to look and see what others are going to be critical. And I can see right away that these transverse horizontal casting edges are going to cast a couple shadows right down across that face, and it's going to be very prominent in this perspective. So I'm going to choose that one. I'm going to say that that angle is that angle. Now you may say, well, what does that choice have to do with that choice? It has nothing to do with it. There's no necessary relationship between those two choices. And I can find the vanishing point for this shadow by remembering that it's on a near vanishing vertical plane which vanishes into this near vertical vanishing line. So it will converge to a vanishing point on that line. And there it is. There's the vanishing point for that kind of shadow. Okay, now just with that information I can begin to cast quite a few shadows. But before I do that, let's do a little analysis device in the front yard. Instead of using that violet triangle, I'm going to use the little shadow analysis cube, and I'm going to draw it right here. And please draw it with me. Let's draw a line there and a line there coming from the near vanishing point. And let's draw the top of the little cube like this. Now when we use this little cube, we have to be responsible to make it pretty cubic, because it really doesn't work very well unless all four faces are squares, and it's really a fairly accurate little cube. Now let's say that the back face to look like a square would be about like that, and then I'm going to draw the front face. Okay, there's my little cube. Now, these are the three struts, and I'm going to very quickly color code the three faces. That one green, and this strut green, this face blue, and this strut blue, the bottom of the cube red, and this strut red. Okay, now I'm going to draw the two assumptions, the two perpendicular shadow angles that I've already assumed. And to do that, I'm going to need to draw a flagpole shadow from this red strut to that flagpole vanishing point. There it goes. It's like that. Okay, now I'm going to draw my other assumption, which is this assumption on a near vanishing vertical plane. Goes to this point, so I'm going to draw a shadow coming down this wall. I'm going to have to use black so you can see it, like that. Okay, now I'm just going to continue those two until they intersect, and they're going to, this one turns into a parallel shadow, climbs the wall, and they're going to intersect about right there. And where they intersect, I now only have to draw the shadow from this blue strut. And since the blue strut's parallel to the green plane, I know that the shadow is going to start out like that. And when it hits the blue plane, it's simply going to go home to the base of the line that casts it. So now I have drawn the shadow pattern based on my first two assumptions in the little cube. Let's find now the flagpole shadow. We may not even need it in this perspective. Sometimes you don't, but it's comforting to know where it is. We find that by drawing a vertical vanishing line for sun's rays through the flagpole shadow. This is the flagpole vanishing point. And if I draw a sun's ray, which would be a line that connected the corner of these three struts with the shadow of that point like this, and continue it, I'll find a sun's ray vanishing point. But in this shadow casting procedure, so our little triangle sitting right in there. In this shadow casting procedure, I'm going to try to use that as little as possible. I'm going to see how far I can get by just using the three perpendicular shadows on the surfaces of the architecture. Let's do the set of sun's ray or flagpole shadows. Here's one going to that point. Here's one on the steps going to that vanishing point. Here's one going to that vanishing point. There are a whole mess of these. one there, one back there. Okay, are there others? Well, there's this one here. Okay, now let's look. Oh, there's one here, right up front, this one. Let's look at those that climb a vertical surface. This one will climb a vertical surface. It will turn into a parallel shadow, as will this one. The others I may have to cut off with a sun's ray. So let's do that. Let's go from this point to the sun's ray vanishing point, from this point to the sun's ray vanishing point, and there's going to be a hidden one back here. I don't think I'm going to see it, but in case it would march off like that and I could go, no, I'm not going to see that, I can tell. Let's go from this corner to the sun's ray vanishing point like that. Now, where I cut those off at all these corner points, the shadow is going to be cast by a near vanishing horizontal casting edge. So it's going to turn and go toward the near vanishing point. This one is going to turn like that. This one is going to turn like that. This one like that. And so I can black those in. Now let's get this one in the niche. We know that it does that. We know that the shadow coming from the other end, from this end, goes to this vanishing point. So we can draw that line. It'll be about like that. We can draw that shadow. When it hits the back, it turns into a parallel shadow and comes across like that. Now, if we wanted to check that, we could just see if that corresponds with a sun's ray by drawing a line from this corner through that point and see if it matches the sun's ray. Well, it's pretty close. We can black in this shadow. And let's get the shadow on the steps. Shadow will climb this step. When it gets to the top, it goes toward that flagpole vanishing point, and we need to cut it off with a sun's ray like this. Okay? It's going to happen right there. When we come to the shadow of that corner, the shadow is now being cast by this near vanishing horizontal line. So the shadow will turn, go toward the near vanishing point. Now we need to raise up this vertical surface again of this step. So we put a handle on it, we raise it vertically to that point, and we can see then that its shadow is going to come right down from the base of this red casting edge to that point like that. We just need the bottom of it. We just need that much of it. Where it hits the nose, it turns into a parallel shadow and goes toward the near vanishing point. When it hits the back surface, it just returns to the line that casts it. So we can now blacken in this shadow. We only have 2 or 3 more to go. We need to find out where the shadow of this corner is going to be. And to do that, we run a sun's ray from there to the sun's ray vanishing point, like that. And it tells us that those two will intersect just before the intersection of the wall and the roof. So we're going to get a teeny tiny parallel shadow right there. We can draw a sun's ray, a flagpole vanishing point from this back corner. We can bring this shadow cast by this hidden casting edge to this vanishing point like that. And now we can blacken in this whole shadow. And it's probably the most dramatic shadow in the whole perspective, so it's good that we chose that angle thoughtfully. And it's that angle, if we were going to change anything, that we might want to adjust slightly, because it's one of the most dominant shadows in the perspective. The shadow back here goes like this until we reach the shadow of its corner, which we cut off with a sun's ray like that. It's going to happen about there. Then the shadow is cast by this near vanishing horizontal line, which is parallel to the earth, which means it goes back to the wall toward the near vanishing point, and then just goes home to the end of the line that casts it. Now, have we missed any? If it's working, this perspective begins to look real. It begins to look like it's in light, like it really exists in 3 dimensions. We've missed one here, a very important one. This casting edge will cast a shadow down across that wall like that. It'll turn into a parallel shadow then, and so we need to darken that in. And then we need to take just a moment and admire our work before we go on to the next perspective. I think we have them all. If we wanted to take the time, we could improve the way the perspective looks by just whitening the remaining vertical surfaces which face us. And this wall back here would be important to whiten. Okay, and the steps, 3 faces of the steps. Notice that we're just whitening one of the vertical surfaces. We don't need to whiten both of them. If we had time, we could make a different whiteness on the near vanishing vertical planes. Now the next perspective on which we're going to cast shadows looks like this, and it's somewhat more complicated. So if you didn't understand what we just did, you probably ought to take the time to stop the tape, rewind it, and go back over it a little more slowly at your own pace. And when you get it down, see if you can anticipate the things I do. And then when you feel you've mastered it, we'll start this next one. The last of the 3 perspectives that we're going to cast shadows on in this series is a little bit more complicated, but we'll go at it the same way we have before with a procedure, step by step, and I think you'll see that we can finish it in about 20 minutes also. This time we're going to assume that the sun has shifted again and is once more over our right shoulder and behind us, so that this surface is in shade, and let's begin by shading that surface, and all other surfaces that you can see would be in shade. There'll be all the left-facing vertical surfaces, and there aren't many, but there are a lot of undersides in this perspective. With the 2-story building, we're looking up and seeing a lot of soffits, sort of ceilings. There's one. We're going to see one there. We're going to see one here. Now, I'm going to adopt a rather rough technique for putting in the tones on this one. So it'll have a sketchy appearance, and I'm doing that so we don't take all day applying black Prismacolor pencil. It also, if you do it in the same sort of degree of roughness, and you have the same sort of sketchy, and particularly the same stroking direction, if you're applying the black Prismacolor with the same direction stroke, it can actually add to the character of the sketch. Now, I think I've about got all the ceilings. And the next thing we do after we've done that is identify the casting edges. We do that by, well, first let's do a little sunlight. That's always fun to do. Let's do the face of the building, which is not going to have any shadows on it, in white. And this face won't have any shadows on it, and that face won't have any shadows on it. If you're a little timid with putting on the white Prismacolor, just hurry a little bit and don't be afraid to bear down. I won't grade your drawing. That's one advantage of videotape teaching too. I guarantee you your drawing will not be graded. So don't be afraid to experiment just a little bit with the application of the Prismacolor pencil. And as long as it has a discipline, as long as it is stroked in the same direction, it'll look okay. Disciplined sloppiness is sort of acceptable in graphics. What's not acceptable is undisciplined sloppiness. If it looks like you were sort of out of control, if it's controlled and it looks like it was intentional, that you applied this white quickly at a 45-degree angle, the eye will sort of accept it, even appreciate that. Okay, now maybe we've applied enough white to begin to see, well, we can do this one. And I think we can apply some white over here safely. What I'm going to do next is identify the casting edges. So if you want to turn the tape off and see if you can run ahead of me and identify the casting edges, this would be a good time to do it. Get white down these columns and white here. And also white here. Okay, now the perspective is beginning to look a little bit more real. And let's start identifying casting edges. Well, here's one. Remember, these are the outside corners that separate a sunlit surface from a surface that's in shade. And once we see that one, we can see this one. And we can see a whole bunch where we won't see the shade surface, but where we know that that edge is going to cast a shadow. There are three. Here's a very tall one, the full height of the building, that's going to cast a shadow, because we know if we walked around the corner and looked back at that hidden surface, it would be in shade. So we know that's a casting edge. Now, that seems to be a set. There's also a set of vertical casting edges that are here. They're not apparent at first, but if you imagine, you know that that other hidden surface that we'd see if we walked over there and looked around those corners would also be in shade, and so that would be a casting edge. Now let's try the horizontal ones. There are some very obvious ones here where we have transverse horizontal lines that separate the sunlit face of the building from the shady soffit or ceiling surface. Same thing applies there, and a whole bunch of them down here. Those are all casting edges. This is a casting edge. We missed that one. We could have put sunlight on it too. And that's a casting edge going back like that. And so is that one. And now, oh, this is a casting edge here. And there's a very important hidden one, which probably is going to cast a shadow that's right there. We may have missed a couple, but we'll probably be able to pick those up. I think that's most of the casting edges. Now the next thing we need to do is specify the angle of the sun. And I think we need to do that, as we did in the previous one, by choosing some of the perpendicular angles that we know are going to be very prevalent in this perspective. We could almost count the casting edges, and the perpendicular, or the casting edge that appears the most times in the perspective, that's the choice we ought to make first. It also has something to do with the angle, and I would say that the choice of this angle, the shadow that's going to be cast by that horizontal, transverse, far vanishing line on that near vanishing vertical surface is going to be pretty critical. So I'm going to make that choice as being this angle right here. Okay, so why don't you put that angle in, and then remembering that that shadow is on a near vanishing vertical surface, and that those planes vanish into this vanishing line, we can just continue that angle until it intersects with a near vertical vanishing line, and we'll find a vanishing point for that kind of shadow. And immediately we can see that there are several others of those. Here's one. So what we're doing now is looking for the sets of that kind of shadow. There's one. There's one there, a very steep one. There's one there. I don't know how long those are. We just know that there are at least that many. Oh, there are a couple over here. There's one there. And there's one up there. So see the choice, there are so many of those, and they're so active and dynamic and dramatic in this perspective that we need to very carefully choose that angle. The other one let's choose is our old friend, the flagpole shadow. Let's assume that, because there are a lot of those, as there are in most perspectives, let's assume that we want the shadow of that corner to go off at an angle about like that. So we draw that angle, and we go over here and find a vanishing point for that kind of shadow. Let's put it right there. So that is the flagpole vanishing point. And we can remember that we can draw a vertical vanishing line through that point. and that is the vertical vanishing line for sun's rays. And it's somewhere on that line we can find a sun's ray vanishing point. Okay, let's draw the rest of those flagpole shadows, or begin them. Here's one. There's one. And we know that some of those will climb, when they hit vertical surfaces, they'll climb them. This one will probably climb that vertical surface. And if we imagined these three vertical surfaces as being one continuous plane, if we filled all those in, we can see that this shadow would just go right on up them. So there'll be a shadow there probably. Now, there's a flagpole here, cast by that casting edge, and it's going to come across, hit the vertical surface, and climb it like that. Now, when this perpendicular shadow hits the back vertical surface, you can see it's being cast by this horizontal transverse line. It's going to be parallel to that back surface, so its shadow is going to be parallel, and it's just going to come across like that. So there we have an intersection which will give us a sun's ray. Because in this perspective, we're going to see how far we can get without even drawing the little cube in the foreground. We're going to connect this corner with its shadow, and we're going to keep going like that. And we're going to find a vanishing point for sun's rays there, which we'll use if we have to. Okay, let's black that shadow in. If we want to confirm what we're doing, maybe it would be a good idea to just draw the little shadow analysis cube down here in the foreground. So let's draw it here. Let's draw the top of it. Like that. Let's get the square top of it, like that. Draw its four vertical corners. Get the back to look pretty much like a square. Remember, to be accurate at all, it has to be pretty close to a real cube. Get the front to look like that, and this side to look like that. Okay, there's the little cube. There are the three struts. We probably need to color code it a little bit. We color the bottom red, and the strut that's the vertical strut that's perpendicular to the bottom red. If we color the near vanishing vertical plane green, and the strut that's perpendicular to that green, and we color the far vanishing surface blue, and the strut that's perpendicular to that blue, there we have our cube. Now, let's draw the assumptions we've made. First, we can draw a flagpole on the floor, like that. And we can draw this shadow, which is on a green plane. You see that these planes are the same orientation as that green plane in the cube. And we've said that perpendicular shadows on those green planes vanish to this vanishing point. So we can draw one of those shadows from this strut vanishing to that vanishing point, like that. Okay. Now, when this strut, this shadow, hits the wall, and we're going to get an extreme coincidence, but we're not going to let it bother us. It's going to come almost in the corner of the cube. When it gets there, it will come straight up like this, and this shadow, there might be a teeny tiny parallel shadow there, but then the shadow will just go home to the base of the blue strut, like that. So that's the shadow. Those are the three perpendicular shadows we're working with. Okay, now we can find a vanishing point for the flagpole shadow here. We can find a vanishing point for perpendicular shadows on near vanishing vertical planes, which are the green guys, here. The problem is that we cannot find, we could find it if we had a big enough room and a big enough horizontal surface and long enough straight edges. But there's no way in the world we can reach the vanishing point for this other perpendicular shadow, because it's going to be, first of all, we would have to converge these lines of the perspective to the far vanishing point. Draw a vertical vanishing line through that, and carry it down until it intersected with an extension of this line. And you can see that we never could possibly reach it. So what we do in this case, and this is the only case we do that, is in perpendicular shadows on far vanishing vertical planes, we just draw them dead parallel. Because the vanishing point is so far away, they would converge very, very slightly. So what we're trying to do now is draw, and if you had a parallel edge, you could do this quite easily. Just draw these shadows that we're going to get over here. For instance, here's one of them. We need to draw it dead parallel to this angle. So there's going to be a whole set of those, and I can draw those in like this. They will actually slightly converge, and if you wanted to, you could make them slightly convergent. But it's going to be so slight that it won't make very much difference. Now, there are going to be that many of those guys, and remember that we're trying to draw them dead parallel to this angle on the blue plane in the cube. Okay, so there are several of those. Now, when this shadow hits this back parallel surface, it's being cast by this red casting edge, so it's parallel to that surface. So its shadow is a parallel shadow that just converges to the near vanishing point. So that's going to be like that. And we can fill that in. Let's fill that shadow in. We can fill these shadows in also. We can fill these upper shadows in, and where they hit that back vertical surface, we can draw a parallel shadow along that back wall. Like that. Okay, we can black in these shadows. This entire surface will be in shadow. And the perspective is beginning to look real, like it's really in light. We have a couple of mysteries to solve. We need to cast, let's see, this shadow starts out like this. And here I think we're going to need a sun's ray. We're going to need to go from this corner to the sun's ray vanishing point to find out where the shadow of that corner is going to fall. And we can see that that's going to be a very long shadow. This shadow is going to go to the wall, turn into a parallel shadow going up the wall, turn back into a flagpole shadow, drop down into the bottom of that planter, go across the planter, up this wall, across there, down the back wall of that planter. In effect it will, and then continue as a flagpole until it hits that, and then go up this wall, and then go across there. So the shadow of this corner is going to fall way over there, which means that all this is going to be in shadow. Now, we need to take the time to investigate about this time which of these surfaces is going to be the brightest and which is going to be the darkest of the sun and shade surfaces. And we can tell from our introductory tape, you remember that the surface on which the shadow of this corner falls is going to be the brightest of the sunlit surfaces. So it tells us that these surfaces would be the brightest white surfaces we would have. So we need to find the time to whiten those if we can. This surface, this surface, this surface, this surface. We already did those. We need to do the top. And that also tells us that the darkest shadow surface will be on the vertical blue plane, so that wherever we get a chance, we can make our vertical shadows on that vertical plane darker than those on the other plane. And that helps us differentiate places at corners where three dark tones come together, it gives us a reason to make one of them darker than the other. That means that the vertical faces of the steps, for instance, will be darkest when we shadow that in, and the treads will be a little less dark. We need to find a flagpole shadow here to find out what happens to this shadow. Okay, this is going to climb up at that angle and going to go across there. And there is a parallel shadow which turns to that like that. This will climb the wall as a parallel shadow like that. And so this we can now shadow in. And we can shadow in that. Now in this perspective, I'm going to take the time, because I think we have maybe a few moments, because I've hurried you so much through it, to add just a little more detail to the perspective to make it look good, just to enjoy our shadow casting efforts. I'm going to add mostly a blue sky. So if you have the non-photo blue Prismacolor pencil, let's put just a little blue sky behind the sketch. And let's apply it at that same 45-degree angle. Let's put a little blue sky there, and a little blue sky there, and a little blue sky there. And I'm going to take out the underlay piece of tracing paper I have under this so that we get the benefit of the darker wood grain. And you can see, I think, that even a very, very rough perspective sketch like this can be quite an attractive drawing with just a little bit of detail. We need to add maybe a few more tree branches. And although trees are the subject of subsequent videotapes, I think you can draw these kind of bare branch trees enough to let the tree demonstrate that there's continuous space behind the building. You can take the green pencil we've been using and put a kind of a green landscape band across there, which helps a little bit. And then spend whatever remaining time you have coloring in the remaining white sunlit surfaces. And understand, here's one we didn't get, and we didn't get one shadow. You need to cast a shadow from this. It's going to go clear over there. Climb that, go like that, and then come back like this. So we need to put in that shadow. And I think our perspective is finished. Please remember that finishing a perspective includes showing what it looks like in light. And that even though I hurried you and the nomenclature was strange and the structure was new, if you will replay these videotapes, I think you'll understand that you or any other environmental designer can easily learn to cast the shadows on their exterior perspectives.